Jeanette.
Alrighty.
All right.
You're rolling?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, Peter, welcome to Texas. It's nice
Thank you.
to have you here. I must tell you straight away that I know your country. I've toured your country.
Oh, wow, okay.
North Island, South Island, yes.
When? How long ago?
About 15 years ago.
Right, okay,
Yes.
yeah.
And loved it.
Right.
What a beautiful, majestic country you have.
Thank you.
And the people are great. And I didn't get to know very much about your film industry at that time. And then the other thing, Peter, that we have in common is that we're both Monty Python veterans.
Ah, right, okay, good.
So, I think we're on similar wavelengths here. Yeah, the Pythons are just, long time favorites of mine. But anyway, we're here to talk about your picture, Heavenly Creatures. And I must tell you, I think it's a very fine motion picture.
Thank you.
I enjoyed it very much. I think that people who see it, maybe when they walk into the theater, they won't realize that this is an actual case history. And then as the picture begins to unfold, they realize that it is. What is the feeling of the people of New Zealand now about this motion picture being made of this famous murder case?
Well, I think that people are intrigued to see it. The film actually started screening in New Zealand on the day that I flew to come over here, so I haven't sort of had the benefit of having my ear to the ground and hearing what the reaction is. But I think people were a little stunned when they knew that I was making the film, because in New Zealand I've got a reputation for previous movies which I've made, which have all been like horror, splatter, gore films, sort of comedies, but fairly over-the-top comedies. So they were curious as to what I was going to do with the story, which is a story that everybody in New Zealand has heard of. It's a bit like the Leopold Loeb case here. It's sort of one of those cases that's part of your nation's sort of notorious history. And the case is sort of misunderstood. It's been misunderstood for the 40 years since it happened. It's always been known for its like sensational sort of lesbian schoolgirl killer type of headlines that because in 1954 when this murder happened, nobody had a rational explanation for it. I mean, criminal psychology was fairly primitive in New Zealand at that time. So they figured that if there's no explanation, therefore the girls must be evil. There's no rational, other rational explanation. So they branded them as some sort of criminal psychopaths, and that stigma has really lasted and sort of become part of mythology. And when Fran Walsh and I decided to write a script based on this case, which no one has really seriously re-evaluated over the past 40 years, we really wanted to take it back to the human beings and to say, well, they weren't evil. I mean, they were two 15-year-old girls. I mean, they did this extraordinarily tragic thing, but there had to have been some forces at work within their friendship or outside of their friendship that led them to this action, and we set out to try and discover what they were and present them in the movie.
If that case were being tried now in New Zealand, do you think it would have the same outcome?
Yeah, I think it would. They were fairly obviously guilty of killing this woman, and so there was nothing they could do about that. I mean, it's interesting. I don't think necessarily that the murder would have happened if the events took place today, because I think there's a lot more tolerance. At the time, this friendship was seen as being unhealthy, and there was a concerted attempt to split the two girls up. But I think in this day and age, everyone would think, well, it's great, they're friends, and that's wonderful, and they wouldn't be judged so harshly.
What is the status of the girls now? Where are they? What are they doing?
Well, we've never really wanted to focus on where they are now, because we always hoped that their privacy would be maintained. They've not wished to have anything to do with any journalists or anyone kind of investigating the case for the last 40 years. They had their names changed by the government when they were released from prison in 1959. But just recently, one of them, Juliet Hume, has been giving some interviews, and she is now a crime novelist, a murder novelist living in Scotland by the name of Anne Perry. And Pauline is still hasn't been discovered, and I mean, we've obviously heard various rumours about where she is and what she's doing, but without her having gone public, I don't really want to say what we know about her.
In the titles following the film, it says that part of their parole and they're getting out of prison, the conditions were that they never see one another again.
That was a statement that the judge made at the sentencing. They were sentenced to be detained at Her Majesty's pleasure, which effectively means life without parole, although the government at its discretion could decide to release you at any time. But basically, you're put away for as long as the authorities deem necessary. And in his sentencing, the judge said that should the government ever decide that these two girls were to be released, they must make absolutely sure that they never had any contact with each other, because it was seen that neither Pauline or Juliet was a criminal, that they were not going to ever offend again, and that this occurred just because of the two of them actually bonding so closely. So it was felt by splitting them up and by ensuring that they stay apart, then sort of the people of New Zealand would be safe.
But I don't know how you would ever enforce something
No,
like
I mean,
that.
of course. I mean, for all we know, they could be having dinner tonight. No, I mean, obviously 40 years later, it's impossible to enforce it. They made the attempt to enforce it at the time they were released. They released Juliet Hume first and flew her out of New Zealand immediately to England, where she rejoined her family. And Pauline was kept in prison for another 2 weeks until Juliet was safely out of the way. And then Pauline was released, but she was kept on parole in New Zealand, so she was actually unable to leave the country for many more years, right into the 60s.
Do you think that even when it happened in the 50s, that their lawyers could have said that they were mentally unbalanced or mentally unstable or psychologically unstable?
The defence attempted to get a verdict of insanity. They tried to plead a defence which is called folie à deux, which is French meaning the madness of two, which was only the second time in history that defence had ever been used, the first time being in the Leopold Loeb case with Clarence Darrow, who he didn't win at that time, and the Parker Hume lawyers didn't win their one either. I don't think that's ever worked. But it was honestly a good thing that they weren't judged to be insane, because in New Zealand at that time, the mentally insane used to be taken away to some fairly nasty mental hospitals, and often they were actually chopped and sort of and their frontal lobes were operated on to try and calm them down, and that was actually happening in the 50s, and that may well have happened to Pauline and Juliet if they'd actually won their insanity plea. So in hindsight, spending 5 years in jail and being released at the age of 20 was in effect a fair and reasonable sentence, I think.
One of the fascinating parts of the film, Peter, is the fourth world, when the girls enter into this extra dimension. And I think you bring that across cinematically. That comes across very, very nicely.
Well, I was, setting out to tell the story, the one thing that I was very adamant about at the beginning is I didn't want to make a murder movie. I didn't want to make a film about a murder and kind of have it grim and depressing like, there's a genre of British films like Dance with a Stranger, Let 'Em Have It, which are about their sort of famous murder cases in the 50s, and I find them so grim and sort of, I think, it's like an ordeal to sit there and watch it. And, we saw this film as very much being a story of a friendship between two young women who had never had a friend before, who had these extraordinary flights of imagination. They wrote books. They wanted to go to Hollywood. They wanted their medieval fantasy books to be adapted into films, and they wanted to star in them alongside Mario Lanza and James Mason. And Mario Lanza's music features in the film as it did in their lives, and so there's a whole lot of life and energy in the film that we really wanted to bring across. And slowly, of course, the events turn towards the tension and suspense as they hatch this plan. But again, I mean, nothing that they did was actually extraordinary. I mean, I'm sure people all the time fantasize about killing somebody, and what is extraordinary in this case is they went that giant step from fantasy to making it actually a reality, which is really the extraordinary part of the story.
Well, Peter, I thank you very much for coming by today and sharing your thoughts with us about the film. And again, I'll tell you that I think it's a fascinating picture, and it's very well done.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Get a two-shot here.
Yes, and then Bob, I'm going to have you. We'll pull back, and if you'll just
Be looking at the subject.
yeah, okay. No, I thought in her diaries were these creatures explained in the detail that
the best people to put inside these rubber costumes were 16 and 17-year-old girls, because apparently they have more stamina and endurance than any other people, like more than what boys have got. And so we sort of set about finding all these young women to fit inside these rubber costumes. So it was good though. It all worked out well. We had to. Well, I mean, once the heads were on, they were all set. They were sealed up, so they could hardly breathe, and we had to have some compressed air hoses and be able to put them down the neck and sort of blast fresh air into the suit every now and again.
What was your budget on the picture?
Less than $7 million. It was quite low, but it was like, you know, double what a normal New Zealand film would be. It was a big budget by New Zealand standards. It let us do everything we wanted to do. All right.
So you okay?
Yes, ma'am.
All right.
Correct.
The fact that Purdue